Amina's fingers tangled in the coarse, dark hair of the man the world knew as the Ice King, pulling him down until his cold composure finally shattered. Pinned against the heavy mahogany of his desk, Chairman Kang, a man who had stood frozen in a world of emotionless isolation for 10 years, looked at her with eyes that were no longer unreadable, but wide with a terrifying, sudden hunger. The moonlight through the arched window cast long, jagged shadows across the room, mirroring the darkness they both inhabited. But Amina didn't flinch. "I was supposed to be a ghost in a maid's uniform," she whispered, her voice a sharp contrast to the smoke-filled silence of the mansion. "But after a decade of your cruelty, I decided to see if the devil could still bleed." His hands, once used only for cold authority, gripped her waist with a desperate, possessive force. For 10 years, he had been a man of stone, unable to desire or feel, until a single, defiant kiss from the woman he bullied forced his heart to beat again. "But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why I dared to kiss the most feared man in the Korean underworld, you have to understand the hell he put me through first. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the years Amina Cole spent as a shadow, scrubbing the floors of a man who stepped on her hands without an apology and looked through her as if she didn't exist. I was a daughter paying for the sins of a father, trapped in a mansion of ice to settle a debt that wasn't mine. Welcome back to our world of high-stakes tension and forbidden connections. We don't deal in soft hearts or simple redemptions here. If you're ready for a story about a resilient woman who broke a crime lord's curse, and the possessive protector who emerged from the ruins, hit that subscribe button and stay close. Now let's go back to the night the invisible girl finally chose to be seen, and the 10-year winter of Chairman Kang began to thaw. The Kang mansion was not a home. It was a mausoleum of marble and silence. For Amina Cole, life within its walls was a masterclass in erasure. Every morning, before the sun dared to touch the Seoul skyline, she was already a shadow moving through the vast, hollow corridors. She polished the silver until it reflected her tired, thoughtful eyes that noticed every crack in the chairman's armor but never dared to speak of them. She moved with a quiet, unbreakable dignity, her simple maid uniform a shield that kept her spirit whole even as the environment sought to diminish her. Chairman Kang Junseok was the sun around which this cold world revolved. Though he emitted no heat, he was an older man of stern, weathered features and a jawline that seemed carved from the very stone of his estate. His hair, neatly combed and slightly graying, served as a constant reminder of the decades he had spent establishing a throne built on quiet terror and absolute control. He walked through his own halls like a specter of authority, his presence so heavy that it felt as though the oxygen left the room whenever he entered. To him, Amina was less than a servant. She was furniture, a functional piece of the background that required no acknowledgement. He practiced a specific kind of coldness, an emotional sealing that made him appear untouchable and unreadable. On the rare occasions their paths crossed, his gaze would pass over her as if she were made of glass. He would leave a trail of demanding, rigid silence in his wake, his posture always upright and commanding, reflecting a man who had locked every feeling away after a lifetime of violence and loss. Amina endured his neglect and the subtle, biting bullying of his indifference with a calm restraint. She saw the burden of the past in the heaviness of his eyes, a moral darkness that had frozen him in time, while the rest of the staff trembled at the sound of his charcoal-colored suit rustling against the floor. Amina remained grounded and observant. She was the only one who didn't look away, a silent moral presence watching the Ice King rule his empty empire, waiting for the moment the frost might finally crack. The moon hung low and heavy, a pale eye watching through the arched windows of the chairman's private library as Amina worked in the suffocating stillness. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, and the bitter aroma of the tea Kang had left untouched. He sat behind his mahogany desk, a silhouette of charcoal and stone, his graying hair silvered by the lunar glow. For hours, he had treated her with his usual icy disregard, his silence a weapon intended to remind her of her insignificance. But tonight, the weight of his unyielding cruelty finally met the limit of her quiet endurance. When he spoke, a cold, clipped command for her to stay out of his line of sight, the snap was instantaneous. Amina didn't retreat. Instead, she crossed the room with a deliberate, haunting grace that forced his heavy eyes to finally track her movement. She was no longer a shadow, she was a storm. Before the Ice King could process the defiance in her stride, she reached across the desk, her fingers tangling in his hair, and pulled his face toward hers. She kissed him, not with the softness of a lover, but with the searing heat of a woman demanding to be seen. It was an act of war against his 10-year winter. In that moment, the absolute control Kang Junseok had cultivated for a decade shattered. His breath hitched, a jagged, human sound that broke the tomb-like silence of the mansion, as the physical curse of his impotence was scorched away by her fire. The fallout was not the explosion of fury Amina expected. When she finally pulled away, panting and bracing for the end, Kang did not call for his security or demand her termination. He remained paralyzed, his sharp jawline tight, his unreadable eyes wide with a terrifying, newfound clarity. He looked at the invisible girl as if she had just breathed life into a corpse. The expected punishment never came. Instead, a shift occurred in the hierarchy of the house that felt more dangerous than any threat. In the days that followed, Kang Junseok became her shadow. He no longer looked through her. He tracked her every movement with a predatory, silent obsession. He would appear in the doorways of the rooms she cleaned, his rigid posture shielding a simmering intensity. He watched her scrub the floors, his gaze heavy and possessive, refusing to let any other man in the estate come near her. He had been a man of stone, but now he was a man haunted, following his maid through the halls as if she held the only key to his survival. The transition from invisible servant to the center of Chairman Kang's universe happened with a swift, quiet violence that left the rest of the mansion reeling. It began with the disappearance of the cotton rags and modest uniforms Amina had worn like a second skin. In their place, boxes arrived, packages of heavy silk, hand-stitched lace, and emerald wool that felt like an inheritance. Kang no longer permitted her to wear the mark of a servant. He stripped away the anonymity of her station, demanding she dress in fabrics that caught the light and highlighted the quiet glow of her skin. When she protested, pointing to the debt she still owed, he merely watched her from the shadows of the hallway, his gaze fixed on her throat, as if memorizing the rhythm of her pulse. His obsession was a heavy, silent thing that redefined the boundaries of the estate. Kang began to curate her world with a terrifying level of detail, ensuring that her path never crossed with the other men of the syndicate. If a guard lingered too long in a corridor she was cleaning, or if a young lieutenant dared to offer her a polite nod, the air in the room would drop 10 degrees. Kang's presence became a wall between Amina and the rest of the world. He would stand in the library or the garden, his stern, weathered face turned toward her, marking her as his territory without uttering a single word. He was an older man, reclaiming a sense of life he had thought lost for a decade, and he guarded that spark with a rigid, upright ferocity. Whispers began to snake through the lower ranks of the Kang organization, spreading like a fever through the dark corners of the city's underground. The Ice King was thawing, but the water was boiling. Rumors of the Black Queen in the penthouse became a liability, a perceived weakness, in a man who had built his empire on the death of feeling. The syndicate elders watched with growing unease as their chairman, once the pinnacle of old-school discipline, spent his afternoons watching a woman read in his private study, instead of reviewing ledgers. Amina felt the weight of their collective gaze, a silent, judgmental pressure, but it was nothing compared to the heat of Kang's stare. He had become her possessive protector, a man who had traded his ironclad isolation for a dangerous, singular focus on the woman who had dared to kiss the devil. The fragile peace of the mansion was shattered when the heavy iron gates groaned open for a guest who did not come to negotiate. A rival boss, a man whose presence lacked Kang's disciplined restraint, arrived with the swagger of a predator who smelled blood in the water. He didn't come for territory or shipments. He came for the girl. Amina stood at the top of the marble staircase, dressed in the emerald silk Kang had gifted her, watching as the intruder laid a folder on the desk, a document detailing a generational debt her father had owed the syndicate. The rival spoke of her not as a woman, but as interest, a collateral to be collected to settle the accounts of the past. The air in the room didn't just turn cold, it became lethal. Chairman Kang, who had spent 10 years as an unreadable statue, rose from his chair with a slow, terrifying grace. The Ice King was gone, replaced by a man whose protective instinct had become a dark, all-consuming fire. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to, but the sheer weight of his authority pinned the intruder to his seat. Kang took the document, his weathered face tight with a silent, rigid fury, and tore it in half without looking away from the rival's eyes. Amina watched from the shadows, her breath hitching as she realized the true depth of her situation. She wasn't just a maid. She was a pawn in a game she hadn't known she was playing. Her life traded decades ago by a man who had long since vanished. But as the rival boss reached out as if to summon her, Kang's reaction was instantaneous and absolute. He stepped between them, his posture a solid wall of charcoal-tailored defiance. He made it clear that while her father may have owed the world, Amina Cole now belonged to the House of Kang, and he would dismantle anyone who dared to claim otherwise. The rival retreated, shaken by the raw, possessive power of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for, leaving Amina to face the realization that her protector was just as dangerous as the debt he had just erased. The echoes of the rival boss's departure still haunted the library, but the tension that remained between Kang and Amina was of a different, more intimate frequency. The desk, once a barrier of mahogany and business, now stood as a silent witness to a transition that had been brewing since the night of the kiss. Kang stood by the window, his rigid posture slightly unspooling as he looked out at the moonlit grounds of the estate. He was no longer the untouchable patriarch. He was a man burdened by the weight of a sudden, terrifying vitality. When he turned to look at Amina, the charcoal of his suit seemed less like armor and more like a shroud he was finally ready to cast aside. He beckoned her closer, not with the cold command of a master, but with the hesitant vulnerability of a man who had forgotten how to ask for anything. As she stepped into the low-key lighting that cast deep shadows across his weathered face, the last remnants of the maid and boss dynamic dissolved. He took her hands, rough from years of labor, and held them against his chest, right where his heart was thumping, with a rhythm that had been absent for a decade. In a voice that was a low, gravelly confession, he spoke of the 10-year winter that had frozen his soul. He described the betrayal that had left him physically and emotionally hollow, a man who possessed half the city, but lacked the ability to feel a spark of desire or the warmth of a human connection. He confessed that he had viewed his existence as a functional curse, a sentence of emotional ceiling where power was his only companion. He had treated her as a ghost because he felt like one himself. But that night in the library, when she had snapped and claimed his lips in defiance, the ice hadn't just cracked, it had vaporized. He looked into her thoughtful, observant eyes and admitted that she was the only reason he could feel the blood rushing through his veins again. Amina listened in the heavy silence, her quiet strength grounding him as he admitted that his obsession wasn't just born of protection, but of a desperate, primal gratitude. He was a man brought back to life by the very woman he had tried to ignore. And as the night deepened, the Ice King finally let the walls fall, surrendering his long-held discipline to the woman who had burned his world down with a single kiss. The atmosphere within the inner sanctum of the Kang Syndicate was as cold as the Siberian winds, thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the stale weight of ancient traditions. The elders sat in a semicircle of high-backed leather chairs, their faces etched with the deep lines of men who had spent their lives trading in blood and secrets. They looked upon Chairman Kang not with the reverence he had earned over decades, but with a growing, sharp-edged resentment. For them, Amina Cole was not a woman. She was a foreign distraction, a crack in the ironclad discipline that held their empire together. They spoke of the rigid hierarchy of the Korean underworld, arguing that a leader who allowed his heart to thaw was a leader who invited the wolves to his door. The head elder, a man whose voice sounded like dry parchment, issued the ultimatum. Kang must cast the maid aside and return to his state of emotional sealing, or he would lose his seat at the table. They demanded he prioritize the syndicate's legacy over the woman who had brought him back to life. Kang Junseok stood before them, his posture as rigid and commanding as ever, but his eyes held a fire that had been absent for 10 long years. He listened to their demands for her removal, his jawline tight with a silent, simmering fury that filled the room like a physical weight. Instead of an apology or a concession, Kang reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger, the very book that held the generational debts of families like Amina's, the ledger that represented the iron grip the syndicate held over the lives of the vulnerable. Without a word, he crossed to the fireplace where a low flame flickered in the grate. In a single, deliberate movement of defiance, he dropped the book into the embers. The elders gasped, rising in a chorus of hushed outrage as the records of their power began to curl and blacken in the heat. Kang watched the debt burn, his expression unreadable and untouchable. He had made his choice. He would rather watch his empire turn to ash than allow the woman who gave him back his heartbeat to be treated as a pawn ever again. The silence that followed the burning of the ledger was short-lived, replaced by a predatory stillness that permeated the Kang mansion. Amina had begun to move through the halls with a new sense of belonging. No longer a ghost, but the heartbeat of the estate. Yet the shadows seemed to lengthen around her. The vanishing happened in the breath between heartbeats, One moment, she was in the sun-drenched solarium, her calm, observant eyes fixed on the gardens. The next, there was only an empty chair and a shattered teacup, its porcelain shards glinting like warning signs on the marble floor. There was no struggle, no outcry, only a void where her quiet strength had once resided. When Chairman Kang discovered the empty room, the Ice King did not merely thaw. He erupted into a cold, calculated fury. He tore through the security protocols of the mansion, his jawline tight and his deep-set eyes heavy with the terror of losing the only woman who had made him feel alive in a decade. He demanded the surveillance feeds, expecting to see a breach from an outside rival. But what he found was far more devastating. The footage showed the perimeter sensors being deactivated with an insider's precision, a digital handshake that opened the gates for the kidnappers without a single alarm being raised. The realization hit Kang with the force of a physical blow. The security breach had been orchestrated from the very top of his inner circle. His protégé, the man he had groomed to be his successor, and the only person he had trusted to handle the mansion's ironclad discipline, had been the one to step aside. The younger man stood in the shadows of the command center, his expression carefully neutral, betraying nothing of the betrayal he had just facilitated. Kang looked at his student and saw a reflection of his own former self, cold, ambitious, and convinced that emotion was a terminal weakness. It wasn't just a kidnapping. It was a coup designed to break the chairman by removing the foreign distraction that had made him human. As the weight of the treachery settled in his chest, Kang realized that to save Amina, he would have to face a monster of his own making. The warehouse on the edge of the industrial district smelled of rust and damp concrete, a hollow shell that served as the rival faction's den. Chairman Kang walked through the entrance alone, his charcoal suit the only shield against the predatory gazes of the armed men lining the walls. He had left his syndicate behind, discarding his weapons and his pride at the door to prove a single, devastating truth. He valued the life of his maid more than the security of his throne. His posture remained rigid and commanding, but as he stepped into the center of the room, the Ice King was gone, replaced by a man who had finally found his soul and was prepared to pay any price for its return. In the center of the dim space, Amina was bound to a rusted chair, her calm and observant eyes clouded with a flicker of terror that vanished the moment she saw him. The rival boss, emboldened by Kang's lack of backup, signaled for his men to move in. They struck with a calculated rhythm, seeking to break the legendary crime lord who had for so long been untouchable. Kang took the blows without a word of protest, his weathered face bruising and his lip bleeding. But he did not fall. Each strike was a testament to his transformation. He endured the pain with a quiet ferocity that unsettled his attackers, for he was no longer fighting for power or territory. Throughout the ordeal, Kang refused to look away from Amina. His deep-set eyes remained locked on hers, offering a silent promise of endurance and a grounding presence that cut through the darkness of the den. To him, the physical toll was irrelevant compared to the decade of emotional emptiness he had escaped. Amina watched him, her quiet strength rising to meet his, realizing that the man who had once treated her as a ghost was now sacrificing his own body to be her protector. He stood battered and bleeding in the lion's den, a king who had traded his crown for a heartbeat, proving that, while they could bruise his flesh, they could no longer reach the man he had become. The escape from the industrial district was a blur of adrenaline and agonizing silence. Kang, leaning heavily on Amina, led her out of the darkness and toward the waiting car parked on the perimeter of the wasteland. His breathing was shallow, his charcoal suit torn and stained with the evidence of his sacrifice, but he held her hand with a grip that refused to let go. They had survived the lion's den, and for a fleeting moment, the cool night air of Seoul felt like the beginning of a new life, one where the debt was paid and the ice was finally gone. But safety was a ghost. As they reached the vehicle, the door didn't open for them. Instead, the protégé stepped out of the shadows, his expression as unreadable and stone-cold as Kang's had been for 10 years. He didn't offer a hand of support. Instead, he raised a suppressed handgun, the barrel steady and aimed directly at the chairman's heart. The silence of the night became absolute, broken only by the crackle of the distant warehouse fire they had just escaped. Kang stood his ground, his battered face tightening as he shielded Amina with his body, his gaze locking onto the man he had once viewed as his successor. The protége's voice was devoid of remorse, echoing with a chilling, clinical ambition. He admitted that the 10-year curse had not been a fluke of nature or a simple tragedy, but a calculated manipulation. He had worked from the shadows to keep Kang emotionally sealed and physically stagnant, knowing that a chairman who couldn't feel was a chairman who was easy to puppet. You were easier to manage when you were frozen. Chairman, he whispered, his finger tightening on the trigger. You were a legend when you were a statue. Now, you're just a man. Amina felt the tremors in Kang's hand, not from fear, but from the raw, human fury of a man who had finally found something to live for, only to face the person who had stolen a decade of his life. The protégé smiled, a thin, joyless curve, as he prepared to end the Ice King's reign for good. The story ends on the deafening silence of the moment before the hammer falls, leaving their fates hanging in the balance of a betrayal that went deeper than the grave. Drop a comment right now if your heart is actually racing, because I know I'm absolutely shook. The protégé, the one man Kang trusted to guard his empire, just turned the barrel of a gun on the man who finally found a reason to live. What do you think happens next? Can Kang survive a betrayal this personal after giving up everything to save Amina? Does Amina have one more act of defiance left in her to save the man who chose her over his throne? And what kind of monster spends 10 years freezing a man's soul just to watch him burn the moment he thaws? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now, because part 2 is dropping soon, and it is going to blow your mind. The secrets behind this 10-year curse are darker than you can imagine, and the price Kang has to pay for his Black Queen might just be his life. Until then, stay grounded and stay loyal to the ones who truly see you. Just remember, the coldest betrayal always comes from the person who stood closest to your fire. This is Afro-Korean Grit Stories. Part 2 is coming. Don't miss the fallout.